Thank you all for being here. I'm gonna um, share a screen in a minute, but just thanks for coming in the sort of longest, shortest month of the pandemic. And I'm excited to be here, but also nervous to do justice to this institution, the Beinecke, which has been so foundational to my research and to this forum, and above all to the authors I'm talking about. So let me thank the curatorial staff, especially Melissa Barton and Nancy Kuhl, and Michael for organizing this event. And I'm just excited to show you all some things from the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection that have been really important to me. So I'm going to share screen. So the book, you can see the cover there. My book tries to show how a wide range of poets remain invested in meter in the early 20th century. And why does that matter? Because when we think of modern poetry or modernism as an experimental movement or one primarily associated with free verse, we forget, or we can forget, how to read a lot of poets who care deeply about what we might call traditional forms. Focusing on meter can feel conservative, but for the two poets I want to talk about today, Sterling Brown and James Weldon Johnson, playing with meter was a way to assess their position with respect to a broader literary culture. And even more importantly, it was a way to assess their position with respect to a racialized society. In general, paying attention to meter gives us a clearer view of all poetics, but especially to movements like the Harlem Renaissance, in which you get just an incredibly diverse set of poets writing in a diverse set of forms with their own formal, investments and things they care about. And these two poets recognized that and did a lot to bring that movement to the public. And as I've said, the Beinecke's collections are so rich in this field and they made it possible to write this book. And so I'm just delighted to be here. I'm going to be sharing two primary pieces of manuscript poetry today, both written around 1930. And I'm happy to say more about chronology, about why these figures in particular were so central to the broader intellectual movement that was the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm happy to talk about other figures that were important to my work and my book, especially Georgia Douglas Johnson or others. But let's get right to the images. And so I'm going to show you some poems by these poets, but I wanted to start with some scansions. And scansion, for those of you not familiar, is the practice of assessing the metrical structure of poems, making it visually apparent, and doing so in order to kind of make audible that structure, and sometimes to help with performance. But the takeaway, and obviously I'm not going to have time to get into every bit of notation or what's actually going on with the meter, although we can maybe come back to it. What I want to point out is that as I went through Johnson's manuscripts and this collection, I just found this again and again. I found tons of scansions. He scanned a lot, and these are from his Fisk University teaching materials. Why did scansion matter to James Weldon Johnson and Brown and other poets? Why did this kind of odd practice of this kind of heuristic, right, a way of seeing the sound of poems, why did it matter to them? I think first, it matters that scansion kind of gives a flattened entry point into all English poetry. It kind of lays it all on the same plane and gives via a new and unusual access point. And this has not always been the case. So learning this stuff, this is weird looking stuff, has traditionally been kind of the province of, say, people who can afford to study the classics, who go to the right schools. It can therefore reinforce divisions of race, class, and gender. But I think Johnson saw it differently. And I think he saw scansion, all this annotation and marking up of poetry, as a way of foregrounding diverse sonic engagements and producing multiple performances and recognizing multiple perceptions of poetic sound. We all hear differently. In a very direct way, understanding and practicing scansion allowed Johnson to give his students an encounter with a canon of poetry that turns out to be always in a state of flux and construction. So what we see on this page is, first on the left here, the beginning of Hamlet's famous soliloquy, but here reimagined or understood as a sonnet. You can see in the first line, you probably can't, but to be or not to be, that is the question. So not to be or not to be, that is the question. So you can see that he's noting the slight shift that makes that line so enjoyable. In the middle, we've got a sonnet by an actual sonnet by Wordsworth, in which he talks about how England needs John Milton to return in order to restore England and English poetry to its grandeur. And then on the right, you've got, you can't obviously see this really, but a kind of answer key to a student exercise that was, they were supposed to scan a rather difficult poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, written in sprung rhythm, which basically no one still quite knows how to scan. So we're moving across English literary history here, but also if you look closely, we've got Wordsworth talking about how Milton needs to revise the course of English literature. We've got Hopkins trying to revise how meter sounds. And so what we're getting here is not just the canon, but a new perspective or way of thinking about the canon. And at the same time, Johnson is preparing his students and us to think about how poets like Claude McKay and County Cullen, Harlem Renaissance poets, are kind of potentially serving as Miltons for American poetry. And that when they do so, it's by writing in traditional meters, writing in sonnets. So now I'm going to move on to one of Johnson's drafts of the poem St. Peter Relates an Incident of the Resurrection Day. Because Johnson is also interested in Scansion because it is a way of getting people to pay attention to his own practices of poetic sound. And so this image here is a manuscript page, as I mentioned. The poem, it's rather long. It narrates the arrival at heaven's gates of the unknown soldier, as in the tomb of the unknown soldier. And that soldier turns out to be Black, much to the consternation of various white supremacists. The poem is largely written in these highly satirical iambic pentameter quatrains. Iambic pentameter is kind of, the thing Shakespeare wrote all of his poetry in. More or less, it's a 5-beat regular line, primarily associated with the English canon. But towards the end of the poem, and we're seeing that here, the meter shifts in an important way. So imagine you've been listening for several hundred lines to this fairly recognizable conventional pattern. You're all set up to hear it. And then we get something wonderful. And you'll kind of have to take my word for it because of time constraints. I can't go through every detail of what's happening sonically here. But what we're going to get, and I'll try to show you the primary bit here, is a shift. This is Johnson correcting his own pentameter. It's kind of rolling off his pen too fast. And he's written these lines of pentameter, and then he crosses them out and he changes into a different meter. This actually almost never happens in English poetry. Most English poems stay in the same meter throughout. You don't get a lot of metric shifts. And so he shifts in the middle. And I'll read it aloud. Maybe you can hear it. If not, I can try to explain it in the Q&A. But those two lines that he crossed out are in pentameter, and you can see the 5 slash marks, hopefully, that indicate that pentameter. So singing, singing, singing. These are the angels heralding the arrival of the unknown soldier. Singing, 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 so sweet and strong. The angels listened and heaven took up his song. It's conventional. And then he changes it. And I'll try to read it so you can hear that what happens is that we're not in this 5-beat meter anymore. We're in a kind of a musical measure. So imagine that we're kind of try to listen for the 4-beat measure. We're kind of in 3/4 time here. So singing, 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 singing clear and strong, singing, 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 till heaven took up the song. And then, just to go back for a second, you see he gives you the lines from the spiritual Deep River, which he's not telling you how it sounds. You just have to know. So I think it's probably impossible to quite explain the exact prosodic shift here, but you can see visually the energy that went into his rewriting of this line. If you see here the word singing in the manuscript, those descenders in the G's, he's using them kind of like a conductor with a baton. He's crossing out the pentameter line with the word singing. It's kind of a perfect performance of the metric shift that he wants us to hear. And this is kind of the closure of the poem. It's an angry poem. He wrote it to protest the treatment of the mothers of Black soldiers in World War I, and so on. But the anger shifts here through that musical shift. Just to zoom out to give some context, Johnson understood how meter, all those rules of meter, were kind of beaten in. They were kind of a training in standard English. They could be restrictive. They could police the boundaries of what counted as literature. But he's doing in this poem and in his teaching this uniquely Black work of listening to and explicating the sounds of English poetry, and then pulling apart the codes and prescriptions that compel and limit all readers. I think that's tremendous. I'm going to move on to Sterling Brown now, who in his correspondence with Johnson spends a lot of time talking about sound, meter, poetics. In his letters to Johnson, Brown talks about reading the poem I was just showing you. He talks about laughing at the metrical parody with his wife. He read it, he felt, he heard the power of its music, but also its parodic play with tradition. He knew that it was an angry poem, but also one that took joy in its form. In one of the letters, the one I'm showing you here, Johnson, he's in Cambridge here, teaching at Harvard, and he's writing about his experience of Cambridge literary circles, the time he spent among these Boston elites who he found didn't so much lionize him. They were excited about his poetry, but they didn't lionize him so much as, quote, poodleize and victimize him. And as you, I hope, can see in the slide, although I'll read a bit of it, he's parodying the accent of these Boston Brahmins who, quote, craves to hear, I can't do the Boston accent, someone else can try it later, craves to hear me recite my verses. He's sort of turning it around on them. But most important here is that he's predicting that what this audience really wants to hear is Sterling Brown doing dialect. And dialect is a crucially contested term at this point in history. It's associated with plantation poetry and racist stereotypes of Black peoples and their language. And Sterling Brown does not write, you can see, I'll show you, you can see how he does write in his poems. He doesn't write in dialect. He writes in what he knew to be a language, African-American vernacular English. And so just to go back, here, he's sensitive to the demands on his performance, on what is expected of him. And he kind of gives them a taste of their own medicine then. So what he says is, okay, they wanted to swoon at dialect. Instead, I recite Watts hymns at them. And these are Protestants. And then Felicia Hemans, the Victorian poetess. So he's reciting kind of the stuff that they thought they had moved beyond. He's reciting their past back to them. And then he gives them a poem here, what he's calling like one of his Slim Greer poems. And Slim is this character that he comes up with, this trickster figure that instead it goes like this. This is the poem he gives them. Dolefully, he says, it was in the gloaming when the moonlight it did creep across the misty moorland where Slim's inamorata lay asleep, asleep, asleep in the deep, peep, peep. He knows this to be bad poetry, but this is what he gives instead of dialect. And this can show you kind of what he's doing metrically here. There are these 7-beat lines that are a kind of conventional, simple common meter. And I don't want to take too seriously what I'm doing here, the scansion or the way I'm going to describe, I'm not too worried about describing accurately what he's doing here because he himself describes this as putrid verse. But what I want to just say is that he's playing with the sentimentalism and shoddy diction and doggerel of the Victorian kind of cultural habits and inheritances that his audience still has in his view, even though they think they want modernism, they think they want something else. And I think what Johnson and Brown recognize and push back against in their poetry is that it's one thing to say you want to move beyond the 19th century and become modern and so on. It's another thing to try to do so through the fetishizing of racial others or exoticizing racial others. And so what he's saying is that sure, there's this disdain for traditional meter among these, or Watts hymns or whatnot among this audience, but there's a deeper habit at play, and that habit is more insidious. And it's just the habit of trying to look for something outside whiteness to try to, pull oneself forward in time. I think this is a fact of 20th century literature that concerns scholarship, that scholarship is getting better at recognizing. But what I think matters is that Brown and Johnson and their contemporaries just felt and then revealed this habit at every turn. And they did it through their meter as often as not. So I hope I've suggested that for now. I'm happy to talk a bit. This is an example of a Slim poem. You can kind of hear the really fluid kind of musical measure. You need to kind of practice it and hear it aloud to get its flow. hope I've shown that, and thank you all so much for listening.